Elena stood at the edge of the bustling park, her eyes scanning the faces in the crowd, searching for him. It was a beautiful summer day. The air was warm, the sky a brilliant blue, and the laughter of children playing filled the air. But Elena felt none of it. Her heart was heavy, her mind a storm of thoughts, and her soul was wrapped in the cold grip of dread. She spotted him sitting on their usual bench, a casual smile on his face as he chatted with an elderly couple. For a moment, her heart lifted. Maybe today would be different. Maybe today, she would see the man she fell in love with, charming, kind, and loving. She walked towards him, her steps slow and cautious, the memory of last night still fresh in her mind. Last night, he had come home late, reeking of alcohol. She had tried to ask him where he had been, worry etched into her voice. His response was swift and brutal, a sharp slap that sent her reeling. She had seen the rage in his eyes, the darkness that had overtaken the man she once knew. As she lay on the floor, tears streaming down her face, she had wondered how things had come to this. But now, as she approached him, he stood up and opened his arms, his face lighting up with that charming smile that had first captured her heart. "Elena, there you are," he said, pulling her into a warm embrace. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that everything was okay, that the man holding her was the same one who had once whispered sweet nothings into her ear and promised her the world. They sat down together, and he took her hand in his thumb gently caressing her skin. "I'm sorry about last night," he said softly, his eyes sincere. "I didn't mean to hurt you. You know how much I love you, right?" Elena nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. She wanted to believe him so badly. She wanted to believe that the man she loved was still there, somewhere beneath the anger and the violence. He showered her with affection, bringing her flowers, cooking her favorite meals, and whispering sweet apologies into her ear. For a while, Elena allowed herself to believe that the worst was behind them. But the darkness always returned, creeping into their lives like a shadow that could not be banished. One evening, after a particularly vicious argument, Elena found herself sitting in front of the mirror, staring at the bruises that marred her skin. She could hear his voice in the next room, slurring his words as he cursed at the television. She felt a surge of anger, not just at him, but at herself. How had she allowed this to happen? How had she become so entangled in a web of love and pain that she couldn't see a way out? She knew she had to leave. She had to break free from the cycle of abuse before it consumed her completely. But the thought of leaving him, of walking away from the man she had once loved so deeply, filled her with a sense of loss that was almost unbearable. She thought of the good times, the laughter, and the love, and wondered if she was strong enough to let it all go. The next morning, she packed a small bag, her hands shaking as she stuffed her belongings into it. He reached out, grabbing her hands. "Please, Elena. Just one more chance. I promise things will be different." Against her better judgment, she felt herself wavering. She will miss him, and the thought of being alone terrified her. "Okay," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "One more chance. But if things don't change, I'm done." He nodded, pulling her into a tight embrace. She felt his tears on her shoulder and wondered if she had made the right decision. The cycle began again. At first, he was everything she hoped he would be, attentive, loving, and kind. But it wasn't long before the darkness returned. One night, after a particularly vicious argument, Elena found herself lying on the floor, bruised and battered, as he stormed out of the apartment. She lay there, tears streaming down her face, wondering how she had allowed herself to be pulled back into the same nightmare. A few days later, Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on her door. "Elena, I heard shouting last night. Are you okay?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. Elena forced a smile, pulling her sleeve down to cover the bruises on her arm. "I'm fine. Mrs. Rodriguez. It was just a misunderstanding. Are you sure? Mrs. Rodriguez pressed, her eyes searching Elena's face for the truth. I'm sure, Elena said firmly, desperate to maintain the facade. Thank you for checking on me, but everything's fine. Mrs. Rodriguez gave her a skeptical look but nodded. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask, she said before leaving. Elena closed the door, leaning against it as tears welled up in her eyes. She knew she was lying, not just to Mrs. Rodriguez but to herself. She was trapped in a cycle of love and abuse, unable to break free. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern continued. Each time he hurt her, he would come back with apologies and promises of change. Each time, she covered up for him, telling herself that he would change, that things would get better. But deep down, she knew the truth. The man she loved was gone, replaced by someone she could no longer recognize. One evening, Elena stood outside the police station, her heart pounding in her chest. The cool evening air bit at her skin, but she barely felt it. Her hands shook as she clutched her phone, the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a heavy burden. She had never imagined that it would come to this, but the abuse had become too much to bear. She had to turn him in. She took a deep breath and stepped through the doors, her eyes scanning the room for the front desk. A young officer looked up, his expression softening when he saw her. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice gentle. Elena swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to report someone. My boyfriend. He's been abusing me." The officer nodded, his face serious. "Come with me," he said, leading her to a small, private room. He gestured for her to sit, then took a seat across from her. "Can you tell me your name and what happened?" Elena took a shaky breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair. "My name is Elena Garcia. I've been in a relationship with a man named Mark Thompson. At first, he was wonderful, but over time, he became violent. He hits me, yells at me, and last night, Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands as sobs racked her body. The officer handed her a tissue, waiting patiently as she composed herself. "Take your time," he said softly. Elena wiped her tears, her voice trembling as she continued. "Last night, he beat me so badly I thought I was going to die. I can't do this anymore. I need help." The officer nodded, taking notes as she spoke. "Do you have any visible injuries we can document?" he asked. She hesitated, then slowly lifted her sleeves and pulled down the collar of her shirt to reveal the bruises that marred her skin. The officer's eyes darkened with concern as he took photographs for evidence. "We'll need you to make a formal statement, and we'll file for a restraining order immediately," he said. "We'll also arrange for a safe place for you to stay." She gave her statement, detailing the years of abuse, the manipulation, and the fear that had consumed her life. After hours of paperwork and questioning, Elena was finally escorted to a shelter for women escaping abusive relationships. Her abusive partner was dealt with by the law and Elena became free to live a life without fear and abuse.